The late summer of 1879 lay heavy upon Cinder Ridge, a settlement clinging to the sharp, dusty borderlands where Colorado strained to meet Wyoming. It was a place of red dust that coated everything: the unfinished railroad ties, the rough plank walls of the post office, the false front of the saloon, and the weathered wood of the small church. The air was harsh, a constant furnace fed by the merciless western sun. But the heat held a strange, brittle sweetness from the sage and alkali flats. In the far distance, the jagged, snow-dappled peaks of the Rocky Mountains watched, cold and indifferent, a reminder that the land was vast and ruled by extremes. Cinder Ridge was a stopover, barely a town, existing for the promise of the steel rails that were perpetually behind schedule. The atmosphere was a blend of relentless ambition and tired resignation. You could smell the dry wind, the stale sweat of horses tied outside the livery, and the sharp, metallic clang of the blacksmith's heavy hammer ringing against the anvil. By night, when the heat finally fled, a deep, penetrating cold would sweep down from the high passes, rattling the glass in the juniper house windows and whistling its lonely, thin song through the cracks in the wooden walls. May Corbin, the self-described widow who worked the kitchen at Juniper House, carried that same mix of ambition and quiet resignation in her own posture. She had arrived 3 weeks prior, walking off the stagecoach with one sturdy valise and a stillness that was unusual for a woman alone. She was not beautiful in the dazzling way of a saloon girl, but she possessed a steady, composed dignity that made her difficult to dismiss and impossible to place. Her movements were economical, her eyes wide-set and constantly scanning. She spent her days amongst the steam and grease, cooking the monotonous, heavy fare demanded by the frontiersmen: boiled beans that tasted of smoke, salty bacon fried to a crisp, and cornbread so dense it could stun a badger. She was good at her work, precise and clean, and the Juniper House was known for the only reliably edible food between the two territories. Her name, May Corbin, was a borrowed garment, fitting just well enough not to snag attention, but too simple to feel like her own skin. She had learned long ago that a story, any story, was better than no story, and widow was the shortest, most effective tale a lone woman could tell to avoid too many questions. A widow was grieving, and grief was a boundary people rarely crossed. But the town, as always, saw the cracks. The saloon proprietor, a beefy man named Elias, often offered her a thin, skeptical half-smile when she came out to serve, a look that said, "A young widow arriving alone is either running from something or setting a trap for something." The minister's wife, a stern, tightly laced woman named Mrs. Gentry, would examine May with a prolonged, silent scrutiny usually reserved for examining tarnished silverware. May kept her peace. Her past was a vast, complicated map she had folded tight and tucked away. The only tangible anchor she carried was a small, leather-bound notebook. It was not a diary, nor a book of scripture, but something far more valuable and dangerous. She kept it in the inner breast pocket of her apron, close to her heart, an almost physical weight of evidence and memory. When she was alone in the quiet hours after midnight, she would take it out and touch the worn leather, sometimes opening it only to look at the blank page, her fingers tracing invisible lines of fate. One small detail betrayed her constant vigilance and her instinct for survival. When she had first arrived, the stitching on the sole of her sturdy traveling boot had begun to loosen. Instead of paying the blacksmith's wife for repairs, she had carefully used a length of fine, waxed fishing line, taken from a pocket in her valise, to resew the thick leather. It was a detail only a person who knew how to live lean and stay quiet would notice, a reflection of thrift and a profound ability to keep herself whole using inadequate tools. The oppressive humidity was momentarily broken one Tuesday when Jonah Reddick rode into Cinder Ridge. He was the owner of the Dry Creek Ranch, some 30 miles northwest, and a man whose presence filled a space without making a sound. He was tall, but not overly so, built with the spare, enduring strength of a juniper tree. his movements deliberate, his hands scarred from work. He had been a widower for 3 years, a fact known by everyone, and one that cast a respectful silence around him. Jonah was widely respected, if not completely understood. In a territory where a reputation for violence was currency, his moniker was one of careful paradox, quick with a hand, but slow to draw a gun. It meant he was capable of decisive, swift action, but possessed the moral fortitude to prefer de-escalation over bloodshed. He came not for the saloon, but for the general store and the Juniper House kitchen. He hauled heavy sacks of salt, flour, and a neatly folded stack of treated hides from his pack mule, trading them for staples he could not produce. This day, the exchange happened as it always did, a ritual of transaction observed in silence. May stepped out of the steam-filled kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Jonah stood opposite her, the red dust of the plains thick on the cuffs of his trousers. He spoke his list of needs in a low, almost rough voice, and May listened without interrupting, confirming each item with a slight nod. Their interaction was a tight, functional mechanism, but the space between them was charged with something the town, and perhaps even they themselves, could not name. They looked at each other more than they spoke. May observed the fine lines etched around his eyes, the residual sorrow that lived in the depths of his gaze, and the constant downward tilt of his wide-brimmed slouch hat. It was a massive, worn piece of felt, shadowing his face almost entirely, a portable roof that seemed to define his isolated existence. To May, who carried a secret she had to constantly protect, Jonah's hat was a shield, a promise of privacy she found strangely comforting. Jonah, for his part, did not look at her directly or aggressively, but his gaze was long and steady, often resting on the rapid, efficient movements of her hands as she measured out flour or portioned the dried apples. He seemed to see the work itself, the competence, and perhaps the underlying tension that made her shoulders stiff. When the transaction was complete and May had totaled the figures on a small slate, Jonah opened his leather pouch. He paid her exactly, counting out the silver coins without flourish. But then, as he turned to leave, he paused by the kitchen door, where a swarm of insects danced in the afternoon light. He reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a small, tied bundle of twisted, fragrant sagebrush. "For the cooking fire," he said, his voice flat. "Keeps the midges away from the sugar, less of a nuisance." He placed the herb beside the stack of lumber and walked away without waiting for thanks. It was a gesture of practical kindness, not flirtation. It was a recognition of her labor, offered in the language of the frontier. May felt a sharp, unexpected warmth prick the back of her eyes. She picked up the sagebrush. It smelled dry and potent, an honest scent of the wild land. She carried it back into the intense heat of the kitchen, the gesture softening the harshness of her day. That evening, when Jonah returned for his promised meal, she served him in the separate small alcove she reserved for ranch owners and travelers who paid in coin rather than debt. His plate was piled with the usual stewed beans and salted pork, but when she brought the side of cornbread, freshly baked and steaming, she hesitated. She sliced his portion, and before setting it down, she used the tip of her spoon to scrape a generous dollop of molasses from the bottom of the pot and place it onto the bread. It was more than the usual serving. A full, sticky teaspoon of the dark, sweet syrup. When Jonah looked up, his eyes meeting hers beneath the brim of his hat, she quickly retreated, mumbling, "My hand slipped. I had too much on the spoon." It was a lie, clumsy and exposed, but she did not wait for his response. Fleeing back behind the zinc counter, she listened from the kitchen, hearing only the quiet clinking of his fork, the sound of a man eating slowly and deliberately. When he finally rose and paid Elias at the bar, he left a small, extra piece of silver for the cook, a token that went beyond the necessary tariff. These small, silent offerings were the seeds of their connection: an extra bundle of sage, an extra spoonful of molasses, a small coin, a shared glance of understanding over the noise of the frontier. The power in Cinder Ridge did not lie with the elected council, but with the railroad. The Brand and Company line was the only thing standing between the town and true irrelevance, and its influence was absolute. The law, such as it was enforced by Sheriff Silas Brand, the cousin of the company's owner. Silas Brand was a handsome, sleek man who wore his badge like a piece of customized, dangerous jewelry. He was law and menace woven into one uniform, and his eyes held the calculating coldness of a man who knew his authority was not granted by justice, but by wealth and steel. He patrolled the saloon and the streets, listening more to the gossip and the railway reports than to any claims of petty theft. He knew May Corbin was a mystery, and mysteries always hid threats to established order. He would occasionally stop by the Juniper House, leaning against the counter, not to eat, but to observe. Mrs. Corbin," he would drawl, his voice oily and slow. "You make fine coffee, but a lady with your skills surely belongs somewhere finer than this dusty ridge." May would only offer a flat, unmoving look in return. "The ridge pays in silver. Sheriff, that is fine enough for me." "Silver is good," he would reply, his smirk stretching his thin lips. "But sometimes, a debt of information pays better. Everyone runs from something. It's just a matter of finding out what and who's chasing." He was fishing, trying to find the story that May had buried. She simply polished the countertop, allowing the silence and her indifference to defeat his casual probing. The red dust was a persistent symbol of her life. It clung to the hem of her simple traveling dress, even after repeated washings, a permanent mark of her arrival from the storm. She was a woman who had walked through the worst of it and carried the proof on her skirt. Jonah's presence was a different kind of symbol. When he sat, his hat shaded him so completely, he looked less like a man and more like a solitary, immovable shape. He was the quiet shelter, the portable roof in the wind, and in the harsh, exposed vulnerability of Cinder Ridge. May found herself watching for the silhouette of that hat against the dusty horizon. The late summer nights were now turning sharply cold, the promise of winter a sudden drop in the temperature after the sun set. May was stacking clean wooden crates near the back entrance of the Juniper House, preparing for the morning's deliveries. The town was mostly asleep, save for the distant, lonely rattle of the saloon piano. Suddenly, the sharp, grinding sound of iron wheels stopping abruptly outside the inn's front door shattered the silence. Not a regular stagecoach, whose driver announced himself with a loud, cheerful shout, but a private, heavy carriage, the wheels biting the dust. May froze in the doorway, listening to the heavy thud of boots on the porch planks. She heard the low murmur of men's voices, hushed and serious, followed by the distinctive sound of a door being thrust open and slamming against the inn's inner wall. Then a voice, deep and ragged, coarsened by years of shouting orders over wind and engine noise, cut through the quiet. It was an intimidating sound, demanding and used to obedience. The man asked, his question ringing clear in the otherwise dead night. "Is there someone here named May or May?" The name was mangled slightly in his rough voice, the two vowels sounding nearly identical, but the intent was unmistakable. May's breath hitched in her throat. Her hand instinctively went to the breast pocket of her apron, touching the reassuring, hard edge of the leather-bound notebook. She held her breath, listening to the silence that followed, a dreadful, suspended silence, certain that her life, the borrowed one of May Corbin, was about to shatter like thin ice under a heavy blow. The rough voice asking for May or May was followed by a heavy, satisfied chuckle, and May felt her carefully constructed world sway. The man was immediately distracted by the noise and warmth of the saloon counter. It was a close shave. She pressed her spine against the cool wood of the kitchen door frame, listening intently. The man was one of the railroad gang foremen, a brute named Cyrus, infamous for his loud mouth and loyalty to Brand and Company. Cyrus was not the man she feared, but he was a messenger, and his presence meant her trail had been picked up. She slipped back into the relative safety of the kitchen, her heart beating a frantic, dry rhythm against the bone. The next morning brought the inciting incident that finally ripped the flimsy curtain of her false identity. May was serving the early breakfast crowd a collection of tired ranch hands, railway workers waiting for their delayed pay, and the usual traveling drummer. Jonah Reddick was among them, seated alone at a small table, his hat pulled low as he quietly ate his bacon. Cyrus, the foreman from the previous night, was at the bar, loud and boisterous. Already deep into his morning whiskey, he was boasting about his importance, waving a charred piece of paper around. "Look at this, boys!" Cyrus yelled, his voice thick and slurred. "Almost lost it last night. A bit of official business. High up, says here we got to adjust the manifests." He slammed the half-burnt paper onto the counter. Elias, the saloon owner, leaned closer. His eyes narrowed, reading the visible lines. "What's it say?" Cyrus Elias asked, impatient. "It says," Cyrus drawled, stabbing the paper with a thick finger, "that Brand and Company is moving some peculiar cargo. See this, a special freight designation? Says it's for the transfer of specific non-commercial assets. And look at this mark. A triple crescent over a broken line. It's a special cipher. And right here, near the bottom, written in a different hand. Reddick's mark, the cowman's symbol. Right on the railroad's paper says Brand needs Reddick's signature to clear the shipment at Owl's Bluff. The atmosphere in the Juniper House curdled instantly. The mention of non-commercial assets was vague enough to be sinister, and the combination of a secret railroad cipher with a local rancher's mark, especially a rancher known for his quiet integrity, was explosive. All eyes in the room, heavy with suspicion and fueled by Elias's sneering curiosity, swiveled toward Jonah Reddick. Jonah did not flinch. He continued chewing a piece of tough bacon, his movements slow and deliberate. He finally raised his head, his face entirely unreadable in the deep shade of his hat. May, standing near the serving hatch, felt a jolt of ice water run through her veins, the triple crescent over a broken line. She knew that cipher. It was not a special freight designation. It was the emergency code used by the Brand and Company depot for the undocumented movement of sensitive materials that were being moved outside the official ledger. It was the exact cipher she had helped devise and then later documented to expose the illicit transportation network. She realized with sickening clarity what specific non-commercial assets meant. She saw Sheriff Silas Brand enter the room, his eyes sharp and focused. But he was not looking at the half-burnt letter, nor at Jonah. He was looking at her. He was watching for her reaction, gauging the telltale flicker in the widow's eyes. The dangerous misunderstanding tightened around Jonah. A lanky ranch hand across the room coughed nervously. Jonah finally spoke, his voice low, steady, and utterly devoid of panic. "That cipher," Jonah said, pushing his plate slightly away, "is the one I use on my sage and willow bundles I sell to the herbalist, Knockaway. Down at the reservation line, it means the package contains dried herb for smoke treatment, not a head of cattle." A flicker of humor, dry as the Colorado wind, crossed his face. "Unless the Brand Company is running a side business in medicinal tea, I doubt that cipher has anything to do with their freight." A few of the men chuckled weakly, relieved by the casual dismissal, but Brand's eyes remained fixed on May. It was then that May made her critical, unconscious mistake. She knew the letter was a forgery or a plant designed to compromise Jonah, but she also knew exactly what the original cipher referred to. "It is not about the herbs," May said, her voice quiet but firm, a reflexive adjustment born of professional habit. "The triple crescent is used for urgent dispatch notices for rail siding crews. It means the delivery must be processed manually at the nearest unscheduled platform." She had corrected a man who had worked the railway line for 5 years, detailing a process known only to those who handled the core logistics. She instantly realized the magnitude of her blunder. She was the simple cook. How could the simple cook know the railway's high-level internal communications system? Cyrus, the foreman, turned his bloated, whiskey-soaked face directly toward her, his eyes narrowing with a mean suspicion. He pressed, his voice a low snarl. How in the hell would a kitchen widow know the railroad yard signals, Mrs. Corbin? The silence that followed was thick and suffocating. May felt the pressure of Sheriff Brand's satisfied, knowing gaze. He had found the thread. He could afford to wait. Before May could stammer an excuse, Jonah Reddick intervened. He moved swiftly, but without hurry, reaching into his pocket for a handful of silver coins. The lady knows the difference between a priority dispatch and a load of salt, Jonah said, dropping the coins heavily onto the table. The sharp clang of the silver was a welcome distraction. But this whole discussion is wasting good work time. The breakfast is paid for. The table is cleared. Take the rest for your trouble, Elias, and let's all get back to work instead of talking about burned paper. He had diffused the situation by paying for the entire table's breakfast, turning a dangerous interrogation into a petty squabble over money. It was a subtle, protective maneuver, creating a smokescreen of common commerce to hide May's retreat. May didn't need a second invitation. She slipped back into the kitchen, the grease and steam suddenly feeling like a sanctuary. She looked out to see Cyrus, now arguing with Elias about the change, momentarily forgetting the kitchen widow. But as the foreman stumbled away from the bar, shouting about the railway's unfair pay, the small, half-burnt letter fluttered unnoticed from his hand to the dusty floor. May watched it fall. It lay there, a tiny piece of incriminating evidence. She waited until the immediate attention had faded, then walked calmly out, ostensibly to sweep the floor near the bar, with a quick, practiced movement. Her foot masked the paper. She swept it, and several other pieces of debris, into her dustpan. Back in the kitchen, her hands were shaking but utterly focused. She carried the dustpan to the large, cast-iron stove. She picked out the half-burnt letter, quickly reading the few remaining lines. It was clearly a deliberate attempt to link Jonah's name to the operation. The original cipher, the Triple Crescent, confirmed her darkest fear: the railroad was moving people, children, displaced indigenous youth, outside the official manifest. She tore the remaining paper into smaller pieces, but not before she spotted a unique ink marking. A tiny, almost invisible fleck of blue on the singed edge, a marking she'd recognized from her own past work. It was the specific brand of ink used by the central depot. Moving swiftly, May opened the bottom grate of the stove, where the coals were still banked. She tossed the rest of the fragments onto the dying embers. She watched them curl and blacken, but she was careful, using the tip of a long, thin poker. She retrieved one small shard of paper before it turned entirely to ash, a fragment barely the size of a thumbnail, bearing only that recognizable speck of blue ink and the faintest trace of the Triple Crescent cipher. This was her reflex, the habit of a person trained to document and preserve. She was no longer just the cook. She was the one who kept the proof. She carefully folded the ash fleck into a tiny piece of oiled paper and tucked it deep inside her leather notebook, alongside the other, older evidence. Outside, the subtle, pervasive judgment of Cinder Ridge began to crystallize. Mrs. Gentry, the minister's wife, walked by the Juniper House an hour later, pausing only long enough for Elias to catch her ear. It is often the learned women who bring trouble. Mrs. Gentry whispered, loud enough for May to hear from the kitchen. Too many words written down, too much knowledge of the world. Such things do not suit a simple life in a simple town. Sheriff Brand overheard the comment and smiled to himself, a slow, predatory expression. The law, he seemed to think, welcomes all kinds of literacy, provided it passes through my hands first. May's slip had confirmed his suspicion she was carrying a truth too heavy for a simple cook. The wind of his ambition began to blow. Brand gave quiet. Quick orders to two of his deputies, rough men known for their lack of imagination and their loyalty to the railroad payroll. May soon felt the change. When she went out to the communal well to draw water for the afternoon cooking, she felt eyes on her. The deputies were not obvious, but they were there, one lounging near the post office, the other cleaning his rifle near the livery. They were shadowing her. The rope on the Juniper House well bucket was frayed, and the old tin pail had sprung a small, weeping leak. May struggled to haul up a full load before the water seeped away. As she wrestled with the heavy, straining rope, a familiar shadow fell across the sun-baked earth. Jonah Reddick rode up, not directly to the well, but circling around the back of the livery, approaching from the direction of the open plains. It was a subtle flanking maneuver that put him between May and the two deputies, cutting off their line of sight without seeming to challenge them. He dismounted slowly, tethering his horse. He walked over to the well, not saying a word, and examined the leaking pail and the straining rope. He took out a length of fresh, oiled leather thong from his pocket, and with quick, efficient movements, he reinforced the weak points on the water bucket's hoop, adding a new, strong leather strap to stabilize the load. It was a small act of physical grace and competence that left May utterly flustered. She had been braced for a question about the cipher, a demand for an explanation. Instead, she received silent, practical assistance. "That'll hold," Jonah finally said, not looking at her, but testing the strength of his work. "Less water lost on the haul-in." He turned to remount his horse, the red dust swirling around his boots. Before his foot found the stirrup, he offered the invitation that changed everything. "Dry Creek is short a cook this season. We're moving the herd soon. Need solid meals. I could double your pay easily. Less mouths and fewer eyes at the ranch than here at the Juniper House." He spoke it as a business proposition, a simple upgrade in employment, but the underlying truth was clear. It was a shield. The ranch offered distance, discretion, and the security of his reputation. May looked from Jonah to the distant, watchful deputies. Cinder Ridge was no longer safe. The moment she spoke about the railroad cipher, her fate in town was sealed. She had to take the shelter offered, but she had to do so on her own terms, to preserve her fragile, borrowed identity. She nodded once, a quick, sharp movement of acceptance. "I will take the offer," she replied, her voice low. "But I will still go by Mrs. Corbin. It keeps things simpler for my employment records." Jonah paused, his hand resting on the saddle horn, the brim of his hat still shadowing his expression. He did not ask why she insisted on the name, nor did he judge the evasion. "Mrs. Corbin it is," he confirmed. "Be ready at dawn. We ride hard." She worked through the remaining day in a haze of preparation, telling Elias a quick lie about visiting a sick relative, as the very first hint of light bruised the eastern sky, painting the distant Rockies in hues of bruised purple and cold pink. May left the Juniper House. Her single valise was strapped behind Jonah's saddle. She did not look back. The iron wheels of the carriage from the night before, the smoldering piece of paper, the cold smile of Sheriff Brand, it all belonged to the past. As they rode out, Jonah's horse moving with the steady, measured pace of a long-distance traveler, the familiar red dust of the high plateau rose in a thick, swirling cloud behind their combined silhouettes. The dust clung to the hem of May's dress and her worn boots, an indelible sign of the person who came from the whirlwind. The sun was just high enough to catch the worn leather of Jonah's hat, a solid, steadfast shape against the vast, empty sky. They rode away from the town, from the threat, and toward the stark, open expanse of the Dry Creek Ranch, two silent figures united by a necessary lie and a silent promise of protection. The journey from Cinder Ridge to Dry Creek Ranch was not long, but it was enough to impress upon May the sheer, empty scale of the high plains. When they finally crested the last rise, the ranch spread below them a series of sturdy, low-slung buildings built from split logs and river stone, designed to endure. It looked less like a temporary settlement and more like a fortress anchored against the relentless weather. Life at Dry Creek began before the chickens thought about crowing. May was instantly enveloped in the ceaseless rhythm of the ranch. She rose in the thin, cold darkness to the sound of men stirring and the faint, rhythmic clang of the milk pail. Her new domain was a detached cookhouse, smaller than the Juniper House kitchen, but more functional. Her days were a blur of primal activity, milking the few necessary dairy cows, kneading dough for biscuits, roasting heavy joints of salted meat, and pouring endless cups of harsh, black coffee. The camp was a tapestry of the American West, a stout, fair-haired German foreman named Gustav, a couple of quick-witted, hard-drinking Irishmen, a handful of quiet, dependable Mexican vaqueros, and 2 Cheyenne men who handled the difficult backcountry with silent grace. They were a motley crew, held together by the common contract of work and the rare, taciturn authority of Jonah Reddick. The soundscape of the ranch was a constant comfort to May the Low. Steady drumming of a blacksmith's forge located a safe distance away, the warm smell of baking bread mingling with the sharp scent of cut cedar, and the soft, monotonous clanging of a cowbell worn by an old, guiding steer in the night. It was an honest, grinding life. May was known only as Mrs. Corbin, the new cook. Jonah established the rules on the first day, not through a shouted order, but through a statement delivered with quiet certainty to the crew as they gathered for the morning meal. Mrs. Corbin is here to cook, Jonah said, standing beside the massive cast-iron stove. She is not here to answer questions. Any man who asks after her business or bothers her work will answer to me first, and then to the road. Do you understand? The understanding was immediate. Jonah was a man of few words, and his quiet command was absolute. This was the structure of her safety, a wide, carefully maintained boundary. Jonah honored an unspoken covenant. No touch, no questions, no pressure. He was a silent sentinel, always present in the periphery when she needed him, but never close enough to demand anything of her. Their relationship settled into a series of functional exchanges punctuated by brief, often humorous, dialogue. One afternoon, May discovered the young Mexican vaquero, Lupe Ortega, asleep in the shade of the cookhouse while the beans she had put him in charge of cleaning were still gritty. Lupe was a gentle soul, handy with a rope and possessed of a melancholy tune on his harmonica, but easily distracted. May snatched the pan of beans, her voice sharper than a cold wind. Lupe Ortega, these black beans won't wash themselves. If you try to act like a greenhorn who doesn't know how to scrub a pot, I will feed you cold water and hardtack for a week. Jonah, who was quietly mending a bridle nearby, lifted his head and offered a thin, almost imperceptible smile. This was his protective endorsement. He was allowing her to establish her own domain with force, lending her his authority without having to step in. Lupe, chastened, quickly snatched the pan back. Mrs. Corbin, my apologies. The sun made me forget my duties. The sun, May retorted, is only an excuse for the lazy. Later, Jonah offered his dry commentary. You run a tight ship, Mrs. Corbin. Dry Creek, May replied, looking him straight in the eye. Needs more than just tight ropes and fences. It needs discipline. Indeed, Jonah murmured, returning to his bridle. The boundaries of their intimacy were set by the simple necessities of ranch life, a form of rustic, safe sensuality. One evening, after a particularly hard day of riding fence lines, Jonah returned with a gaping tear across the shoulder of his worn denim shirt, ripped by barbed wire. He laid the shirt wordlessly on the counter. May took it up, retrieving her small sewing kit. She sat on the bench outside the cookhouse in the late afternoon light, threading a strong length of white linen thread onto her needle. Jonah stood near her, ostensibly cleaning his bowie knife, but keeping a still attention on her hands. She began to stitch, her needle moving swiftly and surely. The fabric was thin from repeated washing, and as she drew the 2 sides of the tear together, her fingers inevitably brushed the sun-darkened, corded skin of his shoulder. The touch was accidental, purely functional, yet electric. The skin beneath her finger pads was rough, warm, and tightly muscled from years of labor. It was a brief, profound physical connection, necessitated by the repair. Jonah's only reaction was a low, steady exhale. "That needle is sharp," he observed, his voice quiet, watching the precise movement of the thread. "Your hide is tougher," May countered, her own voice steady, refusing to acknowledge the physical heat rising in her face. "Seems like you're built to withstand a tear." "We all get ripped up out here," he replied, his eyes finally meeting hers. "Just a question of who knows how to sew us back together." The white linen thread, now tightly looping its way across the tear, became a powerful symbol. It represented the small acts of repair that held their lives together, not just patching the canvas of his shirt, but mending the fabric of her broken, fugitive existence. May had used that same linen thread to mend her boot sole, and now she was using it to mend the protective layer of the man shielding her. It was a constant reminder that life was a process of endlessly patching, of tying together loose ends. Similarly, Jonah's large-handled hunting knife remained a silent fixture. He never took it inside the cookhouse, but it was always left just outside the door, leaning against the doorframe. Within easy reach, it was a quiet, constant assurance, a physical manifestation of his commitment to her unspoken protection. Despite the security of the ranch, May's old habits of surveillance did not fade. She would listen carefully to the men's conversations, especially when they discussed the Brand and Company Railway. One day, the supply wagon returned from a distant, isolated rail siding, bringing with it a stack of wooden shipping tags used for large freight. These tags, bearing various coded numbers and symbols, were used as kindling in the cookhouse. While stacking them, May spotted a repetitive mark on several of the tags, a small, almost ornamental flourish tucked into the corner of the standard manifest code. It was a precise, stylized curl that she instantly recognized. It matched the intricate pattern of the specialized internal ciphers recorded in her leather notebook. She had found a second, independent source of confirmation, proving the clandestine operation was widespread. She moved quickly to discard the tags into the firebox, but not before she surreptitiously copied the full manifest number, committing it to memory. Later, alone in her room, she opened her notebook. The ash fleck from Cinder Ridge was still tucked safe inside. She hesitated, pen hovering over the page. Recording the new code would confirm her past identity and the danger she carried. She briefly wrote the numbers down. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, she smeared the ink and rubbed the page clean with a wet cloth. She could not risk putting more of her truth on paper. Yet the knowledge itself became a heavy burden she carried for Jonah. Dry Creek was not completely isolated. A mile down the river lived the aging Mrs. Whitcomb, a tough, kind-hearted widow who ran a small claim. She often rode over to trade fresh cream for coffee grounds and gossip. Mrs. Whitcomb, a woman who had seen the worst and best of the territory, took a liking to May, treating her with a quiet, maternal concern that was rare and profoundly touching. She spoke of May not as a suspicious figure, but as a young woman trying to make a hard life work. May also learned of Nako-E, the respected Native American healer from the nearby encampment, an old acquaintance of Jonah's late wife, who maintained a formal, respectful distance from the ranch, but held a powerful influence over the local indigenous community. Jonah often visited Nako-E for supplies or to exchange news away from the prying ears of Cinder Ridge. May understood this was Jonah's source of private, non-commercial information, the silent grapevine of the territory. Despite the shield Jonah provided, the relentless social judgment of Cinder Ridge found its way to Dry Creek. Rumors traveled like brushfire across the plains. The young widow is living amongst a crew of single men. She is too quiet. She is too watchful. One day, Lupe brought back the mail from Cinder Ridge. May received an anonymous letter, wrapped in cheap, brown paper and addressed simply to the cook. Inside, the message was scrawled in angry, uneven handwriting. "A woman without roots is a snare. A piece of unplanted seed that belongs to the dust. Leave this man alone. The letter was venomous, a direct attack on her lack of social standing and her ambiguous identity. It hurt because it articulated the very fears she had lived with for months. She burned the note without reading it twice, throwing the ashes to the wind, refusing to give the hate any permanent place. But the letter served as a powerful reminder of her precarious position. She was fighting a silent war on two fronts, the danger of the railroad and the hostility of the community. The emotional counterstrike came from Jonah, silent and profound. One evening, after she had been working on a batch of particularly tough leather hides she intended to use for patching, she collapsed into her cot, exhausted. The next morning, when she opened the cookhouse door, a small, square package sat just outside, wrapped in plain burlap. Inside was a pair of newly made boots. They were fashioned from soft, durable calf skin, meticulously stitched. With soles thick enough for mountain riding, they were perfectly shaped, designed to cradle the precise measurements of her own worn, salvaged boots. There was no card, no message, and no signature. The boots were a complete statement of care and observation. Jonah had measured her needs, silently noted the way she walked, and provided her with the most essential item of survival in the West. He had seen the fishing line stitching on her old boots and replaced them with a foundation of strength. The emotional push was a silent, powerful affirmation: you are seen, you are valued, and your survival matters. May knelt on the dusty floor, the soft leather cool against her fingers, and a profound, aching lump formed in her throat. She fought a sudden, overwhelming urge to weep. This gift intensified the internal struggle that was slowly tearing at her. The Dry Creek Ranch was a safe harbor, a place where she could finally breathe, where she carried the truth about Marion Hale, the former depot clerk. The woman who ran with evidence could finally rest. Yet, her presence here was a magnetic pull, drawing the danger of Sheriff Brand closer to Jonah. The silent conflict raged: should I stay and trust the shield, or leave and protect the man who offered it? She pulled out her notebook again. She recorded the new Brand and Company manifest code from the tags she had seen, writing it clearly this time. A permanent record. Then, she opened the book to a clean page and began to write. Not facts or figures, but a letter to a fictional marshal in Fort Laramie, laying out the evidence and the name's her real name, Marion Hale, along with the codes and dates. She wrote the entire letter, a full, complex confession and accusation. She sealed the page, ready to tear it out and mail it, ready to leave and face the music alone. But then, she looked through the cookhouse window at the shadow of Jonah Reddick, sitting quietly by the fire, mending his own worn leather gear. He was not looking at her, but she felt the unmoving, solid presence of his commitment. She looked at the new boots he had left her, a promise made without words. She stood slowly, walked to the firebox, and instead of tearing out the page, she took the full, written letter, still attached in the notebook, and reread the name Marion Hale. With a deep sigh, she smeared the ink on the page again, obscuring her real name and the evidence she had just carefully laid out. She could not leave. Not yet. She could not condemn the man who saw her only as the competent cook named Mrs. Corbin, the woman who needed a pair of good boots, by leaving a paper trail that led the wolves to his door. Her lie was a necessary shield, but the truth, the dangerous truth of the railroad's crimes, was still burning in her pocket, waiting for the right moment to surface. The internal conflict was far from over. It was merely simmering, waiting for the inevitable heat that would force her hand. The small fleck of ash and ink that May had saved from Cinder Ridge felt heavier than gold inside her leather notebook. It was a fragment of the truth she carried, but it needed a context, a living witness. That witness arrived unexpectedly on a battered wooden card. Lupe Ortega, the young vaquero, was a habitual collector of interesting debris. After a trip to the nearest rail depot to pick up some fencing wire, He brought back a handful of discarded wooden freight tags that had been thrown onto the kindling pile. He showed one to May while she was grinding coffee.
"Look, Mrs. Corbin,"
Lupe said, pointing with a dusty finger. "This tag is carved with the railroad cipher, but someone used a hard bone or something to press an extra mark on the back. It is a star, but not a star. You understand, looks like a wheel missing a spoke." May took the tag. Her breath caught. The wheel missing a spoke was the bone mark, the personal identifier of the senior yard foreman at Owl's Bluff, a man who had mysteriously disappeared shortly after she fled. It was the mark he had used to denote the freight cars containing the sensitive, undocumented cargo, the very cargo the Triple Crescent cipher referred to. She looked at the small piece of wood, then remembered the minuscule ink speck in her notebook. The original, burned letter had mentioned the cargo and Owl's Bluff. The physical tag? Discarded here at Dry Creek. Confirmed the network's reach. The connection was made. The truth of her past, the identity she had sacrificed to survive, began to surface. May Corbin was Marion Hale, and she had served as the freight log secretary at the Central Owl's Bluff Depot for Brandon Company. It was there that she had discovered the horrifying extent of the network, a systematic, quiet transportation of desperate and vulnerable individuals, particularly indigenous children and impoverished workers, using the rail lines as a hidden road of exploitation. When she attempted to voice her concerns internally, the foreman who used the bone mark, an ally, had vanished, silenced by Brand's influence. Marion had grabbed the ledger, changed her name, and run. She was not just running from the past, she was running with the evidence. Her counterforce in this unfolding drama was Jonah. He operated outside the realm of official, corrupted law. He kept a quiet compact with Nakoe, the respected Native American doctor and healer, whose people occupied a nearby tract of land. Jonah knew that Sheriff Brand and his railroad cousin routinely used the law to seize land, manipulate prices, and intimidate local ranchers. Their arrangement was simple. Jonah exchanged salt, metal goods, and protection for Nakoe's family against rogue elements. Nakoe exchanged timely, discreet intelligence about the movement of men, surveyors, and suspicious freight. Jonah was well aware that Brand was building a legal trap around him, and his alliance with Nakoe gave him eyes in places the law could not reach. A brutal, unyielding drought now gripped the land, turning the already red dust of the high plains into a suffocating powder. The grass had withered to straw, and the Dry Creek, the ranch's namesake, was reduced to a miserable trickle. The cattle herd began to suffer, their low moaning a constant, agonizing sound in the heat. The natural conflict forced May and Jonah together. They had to move the herd quickly to a hidden, high-altitude creek that Jonah knew from his youth, a desperate, dangerous gamble against the sun. The journey was a stunning, terrifying encounter with the desolate beauty of the land. The sun beat down with the weight of a physical hammer, and the sheer scale of the wilderness, vast and menacing, made the human concerns of railroad ciphers feel insignificant. May rode alongside Jonah, her new, sturdy boots finding their footing on the uneven rock. Her presence was purely functional. She was there to keep the crew fed and watered on the trail, a difficult task with dwindling supplies. Midway through the punishing ride, after 3 days of relentless sun, May looked over at Jonah. His face was streaked with sweat and dust. His lips cracked, but his jaw remained set, betraying no weakness. "If you try to pretend you are not exhausted again, Mr. Reddick," May said, her voice rough from the dry air, "I will feed you only thin gruel for a week when we get back, and that's a promise." Jonah's gaze shifted to her, and the ghost of a smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Mrs. Corbin, that is a cruel measure. That is a threat of genuine hardship." "It is a necessary measure," she countered. "I need you to survive this, not just endure it." The brief, dry humor was a necessary salve, easing the tension that stretched taut between the necessity of their survival and the constant awareness of the danger they carried. That night, They camped on a high ledge overlooking a bone-dry riverbed. The air, though far less hot, was viciously cold. The wind a relentless, cutting force. After she finished serving the small portions of supper, May sat wrapped tightly in her thin shawl, shivering uncontrollably as the wind whipped around the camp's small fire. Jonah rose quietly, walking over to his pack horse. He returned not with a tool, but with his heavy, dark canvas coat, a solid, substantial garment lined with thick wool. He draped it over her shoulders without a word. May pulled the coat tight around herself. It smelled faintly of leather, horse, and the clean, dry scent of sage. The warmth was instant and overwhelming. Jonah then sat down on the other side of the fire, turning his back to her. His posture was protective, an unwavering shield against the camp, the cold, and the night. It was a physical commitment to her comfort that required no verbal explanation. "Go to sleep, Mrs. Corbin," he said, his voice soft, almost swallowed by the wind. "I'll take the first watch." May knew that he had turned his back so she could sleep without feeling observed, judged, or desired. It was a profound act of respect, prioritizing her comfort and privacy over his own. Meanwhile, back in Cinder Ridge, Sheriff Brand was not idle. Having lost the cook, he sought to destabilize the rancher who had protected her. He fabricated a pretense, citing a new temporary regulation put forth by the railroad's land division. He rode out to Dry Creek in Jonah's absence and presented Gustav, the foreman, with a document demanding a transit tax on all cattle passing over railroad-adjacent lands. It was a blatant extortion attempt, designed to cripple the ranch's finances or force Jonah to sign an security sponsorship agreement with Brand and Company, placing the ranch under the railroad's legal thumb. Gustav, loyal to Jonah, refused to sign, citing his lack of authority. Brand left the document on the table with a cold smile. "The tax is due upon the herd's return. Reddick will find the debt will be settled one way or another." The threat was clear. Brand needed to either control Jonah's land or break his spirit, and he knew that May was the weak point. He ordered a small group of outside men, paid specifically for deniability, to follow them back to Dry Creek. The order was simple: teach the cook a lesson, show Reddick what happens when he shelters strays. When Jonah and the crew finally returned a week later, exhausted but having saved the herd, a sense of weary relief settled over the ranch. But danger was already waiting. May was in the cookhouse that afternoon, clearing out some old supplies in a small, external wooden shed used for kindling and oil reserves. The shed was cramped and dark, smelling strongly of wood dust and kerosene. She was bent over, moving heavy cans, when the door slammed shut with a sharp, final thunk. The latch outside slid home. May straightened up, instantly alert. She heard the soft, retreating footsteps of two men. She tried the door, but the heavy iron latch held fast. The shed was tiny, barely breathing room, and the air was thick with the fumes of a spilled oil lamp left precariously close to the pile of dried kindling. Fear, cold and sharp, gripped her. This was not a warning. It was an attempt at a final solution, designed to look like a terrible kitchen accident. May braced herself against the door, listening intently. She heard no shouts, no laughter, only the distant, normal sounds of the ranch. The men who did this were professionals in cruelty, working silently and discreetly. She heard a small, disturbing sound, a soft, sizzling crackle. Looking down, she saw it immediately. A thread of smoke was curling from beneath the crack of the door. A slow, determined fire had been started in the dry grass just outside the shed. The oil fumes inside were potent, waiting only for a rising temperature or a stray spark. May pressed her ear to the wood, straining against the fear. She needed to shout, but the sheer distance to the main ranch buildings and the heavy thickness of the wood meant her cries might not carry, or worse, they might only alert the attackers to return and finish the job. Just as the smoke thickened and the air began to feel heavy with pre-combustion heat, she heard a new sound, a subtle, almost silent click. The heavy iron latch lifted. The door swung open slowly, revealing the tall, broad silhouette of Jonah Reddick. He said nothing. His face, still beneath the brim of his hat, was a mask of cold fury and focus. He simply reached in, his hands finding her waist, and lifted her out of the shed as effortlessly as she would lift a sack of flour. He set her down gently, stepping away from the rising heat of the small, quickly growing blaze. He then walked to the burning spot. Grabbing a nearby saddle blanket, he stamped down the fire with 3 quick, brutal stomps of his boot, then smothered the smoldering grass with the blanket. The entire episode, the lift, the safe removal, the extinction of the fire took less than 30 seconds. He turned back to her. There was no boast, no chest thumping, no demand for gratitude. He merely looked at the door, then back at May, his breathing heavy but controlled. May was shaking, tears of fear and adrenaline streaming down her dusty cheeks. She could not speak. The unspoken question, "Why did you come so silently?" so quickly hung in the air. Jonah had been inspecting the horses near the corral, a location close enough to hear the soft, distinctive sound of the latch being dropped from the outside. He had not heard the footsteps, but he had heard the silence where noise should have been. His instinct for danger, honed by years of lonely vigilance, had saved her. She finally found her voice, a broken whisper.
I have to leave. Jonah, you see I cannot stay. I bring the wolves to your door.
He walked toward her, the smoke and dust still clinging to his heavy coat. He did not touch her, but his presence was absolute, filling her immediate world. Do not ever let the evil men choose your place of dwelling, Mrs. Corbin, Jonah said, his voice deep and absolute, the tone of a man delivering a lifelong creed. They did this because they think I am weak when you are near. They think they can use you to control me. If you run now, you give them what they want. You admit their power over you. He looked into her eyes, the gaze steady and unwavering. My camp is my domain. You are under my roof. The next choice we make together. We do not run from a fire. Marion. We find out who lit it and we stand our ground. He had not used her real name, Marion, but she heard the implicit, unspoken promise within his statement. The fire was a covenant, a sealed promise. They were in this together. Her duty to run and protect him had been revoked. Their path forward was to stand and fight. May nodded, the single shaky movement of her head confirming a silent, absolute oath. The threat of the locked shed and the fire had not broken May. It had forged her resolve. Jonah's quiet, firm response. Don't let the evil men choose your place of dwelling was the catalyst. It was time to stop gathering evidence and start using it. The plan was hatched in the shadowed warmth of the Dry Creek cookhouse. Late one night after the men were asleep, the collaboration was 3-pronged. May, Jonah, and Nako-E, the Cheyenne doctor. May provided the internal logistics, the cipher codes, the manifest timelines, and the knowledge of the railroad's operational vulnerabilities. Jonah provided the physical shield and the knowledge of the land. Nako-E provided the eyes and the necessary intelligence network that extended far beyond the white man's towns. May identified the target Wolf's Tail sighting, a remote, barely used stretch of track near a dangerous temporary wooden trestle bridge, scheduled for its first major freight transfer of the early winter. Her codes indicated that the documented cargo would pass through Cinder Ridge, but the true, sensitive shipment, the undocumented assets, would be switched onto a bypass loop and moved across the high trestle under cover of the first heavy snow. This was to happen on the night of the first major cold front, the night of the first snow. But the weather was their first, most formidable obstacle. The brief, fiery summer gave way to a sudden, brutal onslaught of cold. The wind changed direction sharply, bringing with it a fine, stinging hail of hoarfrost that coated the ridges. The trails instantly became treacherous, slick with frozen mud and sudden sheets of ice. The land itself seemed to stand guard, a merciless sentinel protecting the criminal's secrets. The mournful, high-pitched howls of a small wolf pack echoed through the mountains, a constant reminder that they were entering a realm where human law meant nothing. It was Lupe Ortega, the gentle vaquero with the harmonica, who suddenly emerged as a crucial, illuminated figure. He had been unusually quiet as May outlined the plan, tracing the rudimentary rail line with a stick in the dirt floor of the cookhouse. Mrs. Corbin, Mr. Reddick. Lupe finally spoke. His eyes lifted from the floor. I know this wolf's tail sighting. I have worked for the railroad, not as a track layer, but moving supplies for the Mexican crews. We talk. We are the ones who dig, the ones who are never seen by Brand and Company's eyes. He confessed that he was part of a quiet, underground network of Mexican and Irish laborers who exchanged information about the company's abuses. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a small, rolled piece of oilskin. "The railroad map is a lie?" he whispered. "This is the temporary sketch, done by a foreman who hated the Brands. It shows the bypass line exactly, the one that leads over the old bridge, the one they will use tonight. I will ride ahead, to a hidden point above the trestle. I will play a song on my harmonica when the true car passes. It is an old signal for our people, a code they will not recognize." Lupe's willingness to risk his fragile peace, revealing his identity as an informant, was a moment of powerful, human grace. He handed the oilskin map to Jonah, his eyes shining with a quiet resolution. They rode out under a sky of iron gray, with the biting, heavy wind whipping the frost across their faces. The mountain trail was a nightmare of sheer ice. The rising action of the plan culminated in a night spent sheltering from the rapidly developing snowstorm. They had been forced to abandon their horses in a protected draw and found refuge in a shallow, rocky overhang, barely a cave high on the slope above the rail line. The air inside the overhang was agonizingly cold, the temperature dropping so fast that their breath plumed like white smoke. May was trembling violently, her thin, oilskin-coated jacket no match for the mountain cold. Jonah pulled out his heavy, wool-lined canvas coat, the same one he had given her after the oil shed fire, and wrapped it around her. Then he lay down on the cold stone, pulling his shared heavy blanket over both of them. This was the height of their functional, yet intensely intimate, connection. The situation was one of pure survival. There was no room for pretense or romantic gesture, only the primal need for warmth. May lay stiffly against his back, pressed tight against the unmoving mass of his body heat. Jonah placed his arm over her, holding the heavy blanket firm against the cutting cold, creating a small, breathing pocket of warmth. Their bodies were pressed shoulder to thigh, minimizing the surface area exposed to the elements. Their breathing began to synchronize, the steady, deep rhythm of his lungs a strange, anchoring comfort against the chaos outside. This proximity was not a choice of passion, but a necessity of survival, which paradoxically made it the most profound form of intimacy. He held her tight, yet utterly respected the invisible boundary between them, his hand resting on the heavy wool, never straying to the soft fabric beneath. They were two people, utterly exposed to nature's cruelty, saved only by the shared heat of their own flesh, a relationship distilled to its most essential, honest form. In the dead center of this shared, shivering silence, May moved. It was a conscious decision, a crossing of the psychological line. She reached up and placed her hand over the massive, rigid muscle of his chest, near his shoulder, and traced a deep, wide, crescent-shaped scar she had often seen peeking out from beneath his open collar. "Your wife," May whispered, her voice rough. "The storm you told me about?" Jonah's body stiffened for only a moment, then relaxed slightly. He answered her question, which was not about the scar, but about the guilt he carried. "The fever," he said, his voice flat and low against the rock. "It was the winter of '65. I went for the doctor. Should have known the storm was too big. Came back 3 days later. She was gone." He confessed his failure without drama, the simple, brutal truth of the frontier. I rode hard, tried to fix the roof and the stove, tried to warm her, tried to outrun the weather, but I could not save her from that storm." May squeezed her eyes shut, a sudden, powerful empathy flooding her heart. She was a woman running from a storm she had caused. He was a man who lived with the memory of a storm he could not stop. Her fingers gently pressed the hard, unyielding ridge of the scar tissue. "You should not carry that debt," she said, pulling her hand away. "The storm is not a person. You cannot defeat it with a gun or a good horse." Jonah let out a long, slow breath. He shifted slightly, turning his head just enough for his breath to warm her neck. The cold, sterile air made his next question stark, penetrating to the very core of her existence. "How long is enough?" "Marion?" he asked, using her real name for the first time, very softly, claiming the truth only between them. "How far do you have to run before you decide it's enough?" May did not answer. She could not. The truth of her identity was resting on the tip of his tongue, demanding to be owned. But the ice in her heart was still too thick. As the morning light began to filter through the deepening snow, they heard it, the slow, heavy, rhythmic pulse of the train approaching the main siding. May, Jonah, and Nakkoe, who had met them at the agreed-upon rendezvous point, crept closer to the ridgeline, their eyes fixed on the rail cuts below. Brand's trap was subtle. 2 trains came through. The first was a long freight, conspicuously decorated with official seals and carrying clearly marked timber and supplies the decoy. The second train was much shorter, unmarked, and running 30 minutes behind schedule. It was heading toward the unused bypass line that Lupe had drawn on his map. Just as the unmarked train began to creep onto the treacherous, snow-dusted wooden trestle, disaster struck. The cold had been intense, creating fissures in the stone above them. A large, jagged sheet of ice broke loose from the overhang and plummeted down the slope. May's horse, tethered a short distance away, panicked. It reared and stumbled, tearing its line. Jonah, seeing the danger, lunged forward and shoved May hard, pushing her out of the path of the panicked animal and the sliding ice. He threw his arm around her waist, and they both tumbled down a short, steep, snow-covered embankment, crashing hard against the frozen earth. They slid, slowing only when Jonah managed to hook his heavy boot into a deep rut. They stopped just inches from the sheer, slick edge of a hidden crevasse, a massive crack in the mountain that disappeared into the white darkness below. May felt the terrifying rush of cold air from the unseen depth. Jonah's grip was absolute, his forearm like a band of iron across her ribs. He was breathing heavily, his hat finally knocked from his head, his face pale and sharp with exertion. Before they could even speak, a dark, thick leather line snaked out from above them. "Hold!" cried a familiar, authoritative voice. It was Nakkoe. He had thrown a thick woven leather rope, a gift from the ranch hands, over a sturdy outcrop of rock. He was already leaning back, his feet braced, applying tension. "Grab the line. Jonah Reddick, hurry." Jonah grabbed the rope with his free hand, securing it with a single, practiced knot, with a tremendous effort. Nakkoe slowly pulled them both back up the treacherous, ice-covered slope, inch by agonizing inch, until they reached the relative safety of the solid ground. As they lay there, gasping for breath, the sound arrived, a thin, reedy, beautiful melody cutting through the heavy snow-filled air. It was the sound of Lupe's harmonica, a mournful, soulful tune played high on the ridge. It was the signal. The true train was crossing the trestle. May, though shaken, was focused. They did not have time for relief. They scrambled to the edge of the overlook. The second, short train was slowly creeping across the bridge. She used the knowledge from her book, identifying the single-way unmarked boxcar that would contain the undocumented transfer, a car bearing a fresh, hastily applied coat of black paint to cover the original railroad symbols. Jonah took a tin of white paint they had brought for marking trails and handed it to May. "The symbol, Marion, hit the symbol, make the mark we need." With trembling hands, May stood, braced by Jonah's presence. She threw the tin, not at the center of the car, but aiming for the lower edge, where she knew the old, painted-over manifest cipher would be. The tin struck the car with a dull thunk, splattering a thick, white stripe across the bottom third of the black paint, right over the hidden symbol. It was a perfect, indelible tag, a visible marker of the car they needed to track. They watched the train disappear into the swirling snow. They had the evidence, the location, and the date. Now, they had to decide what to do with the truth she carried. They retreated from the mountain, leaving the pristine white mark, a solitary flag of defiance against the brand company's iron rule. Their survival had cemented their partnership. The silence that fell upon the cookhouse when May and Jonah returned from Wolf's Tail sighting was thick and profound, heavy with unspoken knowledge and the lingering chill of the mountain snow. They were safe, for the moment. The unmarked car had been flagged, the evidence secured, but the sheer terror of sliding toward the crevasse and the sound of Lupe's distant harmonica had stripped away all pretense. They did not speak of the truth immediately. They worked. May stoked the fire, transforming the freezing air into a pocket of blessed warmth. Jonah tended to the horses, his movements slow and deliberate, shaking off the residual ice and the bone-deep cold. It was late, the ranch asleep under a fresh, clean blanket of snow. They sat by the massive cast-iron stove, the only light coming from the glowing coils of the banked fire. May was sipping a mug of hot, strong coffee, the heat radiating through her chilled hands. Jonah sat opposite her, his silhouette bulky and comforting. May placed her mug down with a soft thunk and looked at the fire. The time for running, for hiding behind the thin veil of misses. Corbin was over. Jonah had called her Marion in the face of death. She owed him the truth in the face of life. She leaned forward, her voice low, a raspy whisper that barely cleared the distance between them. "I am not who you think I am," she confessed. Jonah's head lifted slowly. He did not look startled or surprised. His face was composed, steady, his eyes reflecting the warm, orange glow of the embers. May swallowed, forcing the heavy words past the lump in her throat. "I am not a widow. The man was not my husband. I am Marion Hale. I was the freight log secretary at Owl's Bluff, the brand company's central depot." She told him everything, the meticulous, soul-crushing work of documenting the burgeoning West, the accidental discovery of the supplementary ledgers, the coded manifests, and the horrifying truth that the railroad was not just transporting lumber and supplies, but people, desperate immigrants, and vulnerable indigenous children being moved under duress. She spoke of the foreman who disappeared and her flight with the evidence, running with the fear that she would be silenced next. When she finished, the only sound in the cookhouse was the soft, persistent hiss of the snow melting on the hot stovepipe. She felt completely naked, stripped bare of her protection, waiting for the inevitable judgment, the condemnation of a lie, the fear of contamination, the simple demand that she pack her bags and leave. Jonah looked at her, his expression utterly uncritical. A slow, gentle smile touched the corner of his lips, a smile that crinkled the lines around his eyes. It was a patient, knowing expression, devoid of triumph or accusation. He reached across the small table, not to touch her, but to rest his hand on the cold iron of the stove. His voice was warm, rough, and delivered with the certainty of a man who had waited long for this moment. "Finally," Jonah Reddick said, his voice a low, beautiful current. "Something worth learning." The simple phrase shattered the ice around May's heart. Something worth learning. He was not judging her deception. He was embracing her truth. He was not interested in the convenience of the widow Corbin. He was deeply invested in the complex, dangerous reality of Marion Hale. The psychological lock on her trauma, the fear of exposure and judgment simply dissolved. She was not condemned for the running. She was valued for the knowledge she carried. He wanted the real person, the one forged in the fire of fear and principle. The moment shifted, becoming dangerously intimate. Jonah stood, moving around the stove with the quiet confidence of a man entering sacred ground. He stopped in front of her. He did not rush. He did not demand. He lowered his face slowly, giving her ample time to stop him, his eyes asking for permission before his body moved. Then his eyes met hers, holding the request. May closed her eyes in silent assent. His hand rose, large and calloused, and gently cupped her cheek, the warmth of his palm a startling contrast to the frigid air she had endured. It was the first time they had willingly, consciously touched. It was a slow, deliberate kiss, the joining of two desperate souls who had found shelter in shared peril. There was no fevered rush, no attempt to take or dominate, only the gentle, seeking pressure of his lips against hers, a connection built on mutual respect and the profound relief of shared burden. Their breaths mingled and warmed, the rhythm of their hearts finally finding a common tempo. He kept the rest of their bodies separate, honoring the line he had set, allowing the connection to exist purely in the delicate space between their faces. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers, the rough texture of his skin against her brow, his hands still cupping her face. It was an acknowledgement of their partnership, a silent seal on the truth she had confessed. Jonah was the first to break the tension, his voice infused with a deep, resonating conviction. "From here on," he murmured, his breath warm on her face, "we share this truth, Marion. We face it as a single unit." May simply nodded, speechless. She reached into her apron, pulling out the small, worn leather notebook, the physical ledger of her fear and her commitment. She placed it into his large, rough hand. "Here," she said, her voice clear. "We share this too, everything." He accepted the book, tucking it securely into the inner pocket of his heavy coat. A quiet, genuine lightness filled her chest, a feeling she hadn't known since she first fled the depot. A familiar impulse for dark humor surfaced, a sign that the real Marion was reasserting herself. May smiled, a little wobbly. "Now that you're finally going to learn who I am," she teased, "do you have a tuition fee schedule for my instruction?" Jonah's quiet smile broadened, the tension in his face finally easing. He dropped his head to press his chin gently against her shoulder. "Dinner," he replied, his voice a soft rumble. "Dinner, every night, for the rest of our lives. That is the price of instruction." It was a simple, profound statement of devotion and domesticity, grounding their volatile, dangerous situation in the quiet promise of a shared future. The cookhouse was silent again, but the silence was now full of promise. May looked down at her feet, her old, frayed boots, the ones with the emergency fishing line stitching, lay side by side with the brand new, sturdy calfskin boots Jonah had silently crafted for her. The old and the new stood shoulder to shoulder, the past, tattered and temporary, finally sitting beside the present, strong and secure. It was a clear symbol of her transition. But the world outside had not paused for their confession. Brand's spies in Cinder Ridge were keen, and the sudden disappearance of the widow Corbin, followed by the fire at Dry Creek, only sharpened their focus. The small, spiteful talk in the town quickly changed from "the widow is setting a trap" to "the cook is a fugitive who changed her name." Sheriff Brand now had the cause he needed to legally move against Jonah. The rumors of a name-changing widow at Dry Creek gave him a plausible pretext for an official, intrusive investigation of the ranch and its owner, citing a need to ensure legal residency and proper documentation in the territory. The social conflict was escalating into a full governmental inquest, driven by Brand's personal and corporate interests. Jonah and Marion did not waste the moment in celebration. They moved immediately to action. Their goal was no longer simply survival, but justice. They spread the map of the territory on a table, overlaying the rail lines with the codes and dates Marion had logged. The white stripe they had painted on the boxcar was the key. They needed to force the railroad's hand and expose the crimes before Brand could legally corner them. "We have the evidence, but we need the authority," Jonah stated, tracing a line on the map. We take the ledger and Lupe's testimony, and we go to the highest authority in the territory, the military, Fort Laramie. It is out of Brand's legal jurisdiction. Marion nodded, the name of her safe harbor suddenly becoming her battleground. The military magistrate will demand witnesses, she said, tapping the spot where the transfer had occurred. We need to go back to the source. We need to follow that white stripe. We need the children. The moment was the turning point, the central hinge of their story. The fugitive had confessed. The protector had accepted. They were no longer two people fleeing the same storm, but partners, committed to running straight into the eye of the storm to secure the justice they both deserved. The stage was set for the final, dangerous confrontation. The final confrontation began 3 nights later at the Wolf's Tail Trestle. Marion, Jonah, and Lupe rode hard. Tracking the white paint stripe they had affixed to the illegal freight car, the boxcar, along with 2 others, had been shunted onto a barely used siding near the old wooden bridge, waiting for a final, quiet transfer onto a southern line. They arrived under a cold, starless sky, the air heavy with the scent of pine and approaching moisture. Lupe, swift and silent as a coyote, worked his way onto the track. He found the car bearing the telltale white slash of paint. He slid the rusted bolt on the main latch, revealing a second, internal bolt, with a practiced hand and a small, oiled piece of metal. He picked the lock. Inside, the boxcar was dark, cramped, and foul-smelling. Lupe eased himself in, finding the undocumented cargo 2 children, a boy and a girl, huddled together beneath a thin blanket, their eyes wide and terrified. They were young, perhaps 10 and 12, displaced indigenous youth, being moved with no names and no records. Lupe brought them out, wrapping the children in his own heavy serape. Marion was the first to reach them. She sank to her knees in the cold rail gravel, pulling the children into the warm, heavy confines of Jonah's canvas coat which she had been wearing. She whispered quiet, simple promises in a low, gentle voice, the words of a former clerk who was now a protector. You are safe now. You are safe. My name is Marion. Jonah stood guard, his rifle held loosely but ready. He was watching the high ground, the approach from the main railway line. Just as they were about to retreat into the woods, the sound they dreaded arrived, the dull, heavy thud of horses approaching at a controlled trot. Hold your fire, Jonah muttered, his voice hard. Too many horses. That is Silas Brand. Sheriff Silas Brand rode into the clearing, flanked by 2 armed deputies and 3 rough-looking railroad men. Brand looked impeccable, his uniform clean and pressed, his smile a chillingly polite expression of absolute power. Well, 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 Brand drawled, dismounting slowly. Mr. Reddick, Mrs. Corbin, or should I say, Marion Hale, disturbing the peace and committing felony kidnapping on railway property. That is a hard fall for a respectable rancher. He advanced slowly, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Jonah remained calm. He pointed his rifle slightly toward the ground, a stance of defense, not immediate aggression. I am on Brand and Company property. Sheriff, Jonah replied, his voice level. But I am not kidnapping. I am retrieving human beings who are being shipped as cargo. Cargo is cargo. Reddick, Brand sneered. These are undesirables being moved under contract, railroad business. You are committing trespass and property destruction. And you are attempting to conceal a crime? Marion rose, the 2 children clinging to her legs. She was shaking, but her voice was clear and amplified by her conviction. She took the small, wooden freight tag that Lupe had found, the one bearing the bone cipher, and held it up, catching the weak lantern light. You call this property? Marion demanded, her voice cutting through the tension. This is a tag from the car. The official manifest lists lumber. The private code, the Triple Crescent, lists special non-commercial assets. That code is a lie. Brand. And I should know. I helped log it for 3 months at Owl's Bluff before I ran. She opened the small leather notebook, flipping to a page bearing the careful, neat handwriting of her former self. She began to read aloud, quoting from her own past the dates, the consignment numbers, the specific rail workers who knew the truth. She was not appealing to his law. She was destroying his reputation, challenging his competence, and striking at the heart of his corporate authority in front of his own men. The deputies and railroad laborers shifted uncomfortably. They understood codes, and they understood being lied to by their masters.
You use your cousin's railway,
Marion continued, her voice rising in passion,
to move children and workers without papers, without rights. You are a slaver with a badge. Silas and I have the names and the dates.
Brand's veneer of politeness cracked. His eyes, fixed on Marion, were pure venom. He knew that the sight of the children and the sound of the logistics details, evidence that only an insider could know, was turning his own men against him. "She's a lunatic, a runaway traitor," Brand shouted, trying to reclaim control. "Burn the evidence, get the car." As Brand signaled his men to move toward the boxcar, the natural world intervened with sudden, dramatic force. The wind, which had been blowing steadily from the west, suddenly shifted, howling violently from the northeast. Brand's deputy, holding a kerosene-fueled torch high to illuminate the scene, was caught off guard by the gust. The torch dipped. The flames licked the dry, oil-treated wood of the old trestle bridge support, which stood dangerously close to the siding. In a terrifying instant, the bridge caught fire. A ribbon of bright yellow flames shot up the wooden support, instantly fueled by the dry cedar and decades of oil residue. The fire did not wait for command. It roared to life, separating Brand and his men from Jonah, Marion, and the children. Brand, faced with losing his quarry and the potential destruction of the entire trestle, momentarily forgot the children. He was concerned only with the bridge, his cousin's property. He screamed orders at his men to put out the blaze. Jonah saw his chance. He had the children, the witness, and the ledger. He quickly assessed the only way out across the burning trestle bridge before the support columns failed. He dropped his rifle into the snow. It was a clear, dramatic statement: people over property, life over the means of defense. "Lupe, watch Marion," Jonah commanded. He scooped up the terrified young boy, cradling him against his chest, and began running toward the burning wooden planks. The flames were licking the edges, smoke pouring into the night sky. Brand saw Jonah's move, and his cowardice was fully exposed, while the fire raged behind him, blocking his direct path. Brand drew his pistol and began firing, aiming not at the fire, but at the unarmed man carrying a child across the burning bridge. He was trying to eliminate the witness and the threat in one vicious act. Jonah ran with the strength of desperation, the boy clinging to his neck. He disappeared into the blinding smoke on the far side of the trestle. Brand's shots were wild and uncontrolled, a sound of frustrated, petty malice. Just as the second child, the girl, began to run toward the bridge, an entirely unexpected flash illuminated the scene. From a hidden outcrop of rock high above the siding, a burst of bright light flared, followed by a muffled thwack. It was Mrs. Whitcomb, the quiet, kind-hearted neighbor from Dry Creek. She had followed them, sensing the danger, and she was carrying her newly acquired box camera, a simple, bulky piece of technology. In the brief, intense flash of magnesium powder, she had captured the scene Sheriff Silas Brand, the local law, standing with his men, firing a weapon at an unarmed man and a child, while his own railroad's bridge burned behind him. It was a piece of minimal, decisive technology used to capture a monumental, undeniable truth. Meanwhile, Lupe, running to secure a pack animal, slipped on the icy bank and stumbled directly into a patch of burning debris flung from the bridge. He shouted, pulling his arm back immediately. He had suffered a deep, painful burn to his hand. The skin instantly blistered and blackened. He was in agony, but he kept his silence, refusing to alert Brand to their exact location. Marion ran to Lupe, guiding the girl to safety first. She tore strips from the lining of her own skirt, and quickly, with the calm competence of her mother, she began to treat Lupe's injury, spreading a soothing layer of medicated bear grease, a supply given by Nakoe over the raw wound. Her hands were shaking with adrenaline, but her movements were precise, professional. The air around them was hot and smoky, filled with the fear and the adrenaline of the confrontation, but the small act of care was a pocket of protective warmth. Jonah returned, helping the second child across. He looked at Lupe's bandaged, raw hand, then at Marion's exhausted, smoke-streaked face. "If you try to feed me gruel after this, Mrs. Corbin," Jonah choked out, his voice hoarse from the smoke and exertion. "I swear, I will eat it. I will happily volunteer for the thin soup." Marion's lips curled into a fierce, smoke-streaked smile. "That," she replied, gently knotting the last bandage around Lupe's hand, "is part of our new contract, Mr. Reddick. We survive, and we keep each other honest with plain food." The fire raged behind them, a wall of flame against the corruption. They had secured the children, the physical evidence of the cargo tag, Marion's detailed ledger, and now, the unexpected, damning testimony of Mrs. Whitcomb's photograph. These were the legal landmarks they needed to demand intervention from the highest authority. Brand's voice, now high and panicked as the flames truly took hold of the trestle, echoed across the chasm. "I will find you, Reddick. I will see how you walk out of this county. You won't escape the law." Jonah simply turned his back on the desperate, retreating sheriff. They mounted the horses that Nakoe had secured for them, placing the two children securely between Marion and the men. "We ride for Fort Laramie," Jonah commanded. "We will let the military law decide what is truly illegal in this territory." The line was drawn, indelible as the white paint on the boxcar. The physical confrontation was over, but the legal battle was just beginning. The ride to Fort Laramie was an exercise in silent, intense vigilance. They moved swiftly under the cover of the continuing cold front, the two children bundled tight between the adults, protected by the vigilance of Jonah, Marion, Lupe, and the quiet, steady presence of Dr. Nakoe, who had joined them as both a guide and a spiritual anchor. Fort Laramie stood stark against the gray morning sky, a collection of stone and timber buildings, dominated by the Stars and Stripes flag snapping sharply in the wind. This was the seat of military authority, a place where the corrupted laws of the Brand Company held no sway. The court convened in a cold, echoing room in the garrison headquarters. The air was frigid, the stone walls damp, and the only ornamentation was a fading, tattered United States flag draped behind the imposing figure of the military judge. Colonel Harrison, surrounded by stern, uniformed border guards. The atmosphere was one of rigid, unyielding protocol. Marion Hale, the former May Corbin, stood before the judge. She felt the cold deep in her bones, but she held her shoulders straight, the quiet dignity of her conviction overriding her fear. Colonel Harrison, a man with a hard, weather-beaten face and clear, assessing eyes, read the official accusations leveled against Sheriff Brand, accusations now supported by Jonah Reddick's testimony. Marion began her testimony, her voice initially trembling, then growing steady as she plunged into the details she knew by heart. She spoke of the Triple Crescent cipher, the freight routes, the false manifests, and the specific dates and times of the undocumented rail transfers. She laid out the corruption with the meticulous precision of a former clerk. "I logged the supplies, Colonel," Marion stated, her eyes fixed on the judge. "But I also kept a second log. These children—" She gestured toward the boy and girl, who sat quietly beside her, "were being shipped as nothing more than commodities. They were moved under the code for non-commercial assets, to avoid all record-keeping and accountability." The children, their eyes still carrying the shock of their ordeal, confirmed her story in quiet whispers. describing being moved in the dark, being told to stay silent, and seeing the same cipher on the interior of the boxcar. Then, the final piece of evidence was presented. Mrs. Whitcomb, dressed in her best traveling coat, stepped forward with her bulky box camera. A soldier rigged a white cloth sheet, and the photographic plate, taken in the fierce light of the burning trestle, was projected against it. The image was simple, grainy, and absolutely devastating. It clearly showed the dark uniform-clad figure of Sheriff Silas Brand, his arm extended, firing a pistol at the receding figure of Jonah Reddick, who was actively carrying a child away from the raging fire on the trestle bridge. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the small group of soldiers and clerks observing the proceedings. The sight of the local lawman prioritizing violence over rescue and property over human life was undeniable. The crude technology of the box camera had provided decisive, unarguable proof. Brand's legal counsel, a slick, desperate man hired at great expense by Brand and Company, launched his counteroffensive. He immediately shifted the focus onto Marion. "Your Honor," the lawyer argued, his voice dripping with condescension, "we are relying on the testimony of a confessed fugitive who has changed her name multiple times, a woman who admits to forging and keeping secret ledgers. May Corbin is a false identity. How can we trust the word of a person who will lie to the courts and to the public?" Marion stood tall, facing the lawyer directly. She saw the sneer, the social judgment that had followed her across the territory. She met it head on. "I changed my name to survive, sir," Marion said, her voice resonant with unassailable honesty. "Not to lie to this court. I ran because the man who knew the truth was silenced, and the local law was complicit. I did not run with gold. I ran with evidence. If I had stayed as Marion Hale, I would not be here today to speak the truth. My decision to run was not a mark of dishonor. It was a desperate act of honor." The impact of her defense was palpable. The lawyer's petty attack on her credibility had been turned into a powerful statement about the nature of frontier justice. The focus shifted back to Jonah. The lawyer tried to paint him as an accomplice, a reckless vigilante. Jonah stepped forward. He did not offer a long defense, nor did he argue the fine points of law. He simply stood beside Marion, his presence a shield. "I saw the man fire on my partner and a child," Jonah stated, his voice quiet but commanding. "I witnessed the crime, and I witnessed the cover-up. I put my life on the line because I believed her word." His statement was a complete, unconditional acceptance of Marion's truth. It was a commitment that sealed their partnership publicly and irrevocably. Colonel Harrison struck his gavel. The evidence was too overwhelming. The photographic proof too damning. The temporary verdict was delivered. Sheriff Silas Brand was to be immediately detained, pending a full military investigation into his conduct and the operations of Brand and Company's rail division. Brand was arrested on the spot, his face a mask of impotent rage and disbelief. Jonah and Marion walked out of the garrison building into a morning shrouded in cold, thick fog. The resolution was temporary, but the victory felt immense. They secured their horses, the children riding with Nakkoe, and began the long, quiet journey back toward the familiar paths of Dry Creek. The tension had been replaced by exhaustion, but the relief was fragile. They had ridden only a few miles out of the fort's direct jurisdiction when the sound shattered the silence, the sharp, unmistakable crack of rifle fire. The ambush was well planned. Brand's remaining operatives, hired guns from outside the county, had been positioned high up on a rocky ledge, concealed by the morning fog. A volley of bullets tore through the air, spitting gravel and dirt near Jonah. "Down, get down!" Jonah roared, throwing his entire weight against Marion, tackling her off her horse and into a deep, snow-filled ravine beside the trail. He shielded her body completely, absorbing the impact as they hit the ground. The rest of the party scattered, Lupe expertly directing the horses to cover. As Jonah pushed Marion deeper into the safety of the ditch, a sharp, searing pain tore across his shoulder. One of the shots had connected, a glancing deep wound that ripped through the heavy fabric of his coat and tore the flesh of his left shoulder. He did not cry out, but Marion felt the sudden, hot, pulsing warmth of his blood soak through the canvas lining. The attack was instantly, mercifully obscured by the rapidly changing mountain weather. The fog, thick and cold, abruptly intensified, turning into a blinding, savage snowstorm that swept down from the high peaks. The blizzard was sudden, chaotic, and absolute, cutting off the visibility of Brand's hired attackers. Marion scrambled against the snow. She checked Jonah. He was conscious, but his face was pale, his breath shallow, the blood already staining the pristine white snow around them. "The shoulder," Jonah grunted, his voice tight. "Just a graze. Move, Marion. They will try again." "It is not a graze," Marion retorted, her eyes focused, the medic in her taking over. The bullet had ripped a serious, deep furrow. She hauled him further into the deep, frozen ditch, away from the path, using her own body heat and the remnants of his heavy coat to shelter him from the sudden, frigid blast of the blizzard. With practiced efficiency, she reached into the small utility pocket she had sewn into her skirts, a tiny mobile supply cabinet. She pulled out her sewing kit and a small roll of cotton and gauze, a kit she usually kept for patching canvas or her own clothes. Ignoring his pained protest, Marion ripped open the torn fabric of his coat and shirt. The wound was bleeding heavily. Using her needle and strong linen thread, the same thread she had used to mend his shirt and her boot, she began to stitch the torn flesh and close the deep gash, her hands shaking slightly from the cold but remaining absolutely steady on the task. It was rough, painful, frontier surgery, but necessary to stop the hemorrhaging. She swabbed the wound with whiskey from a small flask she carried and applied a makeshift bandage of compressed gauze. "We have to move," Jonah gasped. His teeth gritted. "We are moving nowhere," Marion countered, tying off the final, tight stitch. "You would not have made it 20 feet. They waited in the whiteout, the world reduced to the sound of the wind's shriek and the deep, steady cadence of their own breaths. Hours later, as the blizzard began to subside, two dark figures approached the ridge, following the almost imperceptible tracks of their horses. It was Dr. Na-Koe and his young son, tracking them through the difficult terrain with the unnatural skill of the indigenous people. Na-Koe found them huddled together in the snowdrift, Marion shivering but alert, Jonah pale and barely conscious. Without a word, Na-Koe and his son helped Marion lift Jonah. They carried him on a makeshift sling, caving him through the drifts to a small, hidden shelter, a winter tent made of heavy hide and wood poles, completely concealed from the passing trail. Inside the tent, Na-Koe tended to the wound, replacing Marion's rough stitching with a dressing soaked in potent herbal poultices and administering teas to combat the fever. The air filled with the earthy, intense smell of medicine, the sound of Na-Koe's low, melodic chant, a quiet, steady drumbeat that seemed to resonate deep within the frozen ground, a prayer for the man who had sheltered his people. Days later, the bullet fever broke. Jonah, weak but stable, rested on a bed of fresh pine boughs. Marion sat beside him, the silent companion. She took his razor and warm water, and gently, carefully, she shaved the heavy stubble from his jaw and chin, the act profoundly intimate and domestic. His eyes watched her in the weak lamplight. Steady and peaceful, the danger of the trial and the ambush had been survived, not through a quick gun, but through truth, technology, and quiet care. There were no grand declarations, no promises of peaceful retirement. Jonah reached up, his hand warm against the back of hers as she finished the last stroke of the razor. "Thank you, Marion," he whispered, his voice still ragged. "We still have work to do, Mr. Reddick," she replied, her eyes meeting his. It was not a question of if they would continue, but how. Their partnership, sealed by the shared warmth beneath the canvas coat, forged in the terror of the burning bridge, and now ratified by the gentle, simple act of care in the snowy isolation, was absolute. Their fight for justice and their devotion to each other was far from over. The investigation launched by the military at Fort Laramie sent powerful ripples across the territory. Within weeks of the ambush and Brand's initial detention, the Army announced a wide-ranging inquiry into Brand and Company's practices regarding labor and freight management along the entire rail line. The legal aftershocks were swift and decisive. Several children who had been tracked using Marion's ledger were located and successfully reunited with their tribal families. Furthermore, the inquiry uncovered the systematic exploitation of immigrants and indigenous laborers, leading to the termination of numerous contracts that amounted to little more than indentured servitude. The railway's reign of terror was finally beginning to crumble under the weight of documented truth. But the taste of justice was mixed with the bitter cost of defiance. While Jonah was recovering at Dr. Nakoa's camp, Sheriff Brand, having slipped his temporary military custody thanks to a well-placed bribe before the official warrant arrived, had ordered a final, malicious strike. Returning to Dry Creek, they found that the large storehouse, stocked with winter feed, grain, and salted provisions, had been burned to the ground. The fire, which was too large to have been accidental, destroyed nearly all of their winter reserves. The cattle herd, already thinned by the drought and the necessary drive, was further reduced by the early, brutal onset of the mountain winter. They had paid a steep price for their integrity. As soon as Jonah was well enough to ride, they returned to a ranch facing a desperate winter. Yet, the community did not let them stand alone. The tide of social opinion, once so fiercely judgmental, had turned. The people of Cinder Ridge, tired of Brand's tyranny, began to rally. The men from the ranch, Gustav the German foreman, the Irishman, and the Mexican vaqueros worked tirelessly alongside neighbors who rode in from miles around. They pooled resources and skills, and together, they began to raise the burnt warehouse, piece by sturdy piece. It was a rotating effort of community survival, an act of silent apology from the township for their earlier prejudice. Even Mrs. Whitcomb, whose simple box camera had become an instrument of monumental justice, played her part, seeing the two children they had rescued, along with other displaced youngsters in the area. She established a temporary school in the warmest corner of Jonah's rebuilt barn. She taught them to read and write, using the ranch's ledger books as primers, proving that knowledge was the true currency of freedom. Marion, no longer the secretive widow, Marion Hale, underwent her own transformation. She shed the last remnants of her fear, the literal dust of her flight washed clean by the responsibility of the present. She signed a petition, addressed to the new interim authority, to open a permanent community kitchen in the growing settlement near Dry Creek, a place dedicated to feeding the mixed-race children and the newly freed laborers. The signature on the bottom of the petition read simply, Marion H. It was a conscious choice, a refusal to fully adopt the protection of Jonah's name just yet, but a firm commitment to her own identity. She was Marion Hale, dedicated to healing the community through the simple dignity of a good meal. Even Mrs. Gentry, the minister's wife who had once preached against the learned woman, rode out one chilly afternoon. She arrived on the doorstep of the cookhouse with a massive, warty pumpkin clutched awkwardly to her chest. Mrs. Corbin Marion, she began, her face flushed with shame. I must confess, I spoke ill. I was wrong to judge a woman by her travel bag and her quietness. I hope you will accept this. I believe I let my own fears rule my tongue. Marion accepted the pumpkin, her smile gentle and free of resentment. Thank you, Mrs. Gentry. A gift of food is always a kindness. She offered no bitter reply, no moment of vindication. Healing, she knew, did not come from vengeance, but from simple acceptance. Life at Dry Creek settled into a hard but deeply satisfying rhythm. Jonah's shoulder was mending, and their partnership had evolved into a seamless, quiet understanding. Their conversations were full of the dry, functional humor that had always anchored them. Jonah, ever the taciturn rancher, struggled to express the complex joy he felt. One morning, as Marion was frying up the last of the salted pork, he stood in the doorway, watching the sun stream through the small, high window. "Your cornbread this morning," Jonah said, after a long pause. "It tasted like sunlight, warm and dependable." Marion laughed, a clear, open sound he rarely heard in the early, rushed hours of the day. "You speak like a cowboy poet, Mr. Reddick," she teased. "Does that mean you are willing to try the beans again?"
"I am willing," he affirmed, "to try anything that keeps that taste on the tongue." The moment that defined their future arrived quietly, on a rainy spring evening, a night when the cold rain had finally washed the last of the red dust and winter snow from the plains. They stood together on the small, covered porch outside the cookhouse, watching the drumming rain soak the newly greening earth. Jonah reached into the pocket of his heavy coat. He did not pull out a polished ring. Instead, he presented a simple circle of copper metal, unevenly hammered and bearing the rough texture of a life lived by muscle and grit. He had filed it himself from a piece of discarded railway tie spike, using the forge at the ranch. "Marion Hale," he said, his voice deep and slightly rough, his gaze unwavering. "I do not promise ease. I do not promise a life of safety. The Brand family is still out there, and the weather will always be cruel. But I promise to stand by you. I promise to learn you every day for the rest of our lives. Will you stand by me?" He placed the simple copper band, still warm from his palm, into her hand. It was a marriage proposal built on the foundation of shared struggle and mutual protection. It was a statement that love was not about comfort, but about commitment to the difficult path. Marion felt the rough, honest weight of the ring, the tie spike, the instrument of the railroad's cruel expansion, transformed into the symbol of their union, an act of redemption for the entire territory. She didn't need to speak. She threw her arms around him, burying her face in the solid warmth of his neck. He held her tight, a long, profound embrace, pressing his cheek against hers. He lifted his hand and gently removed his wide-brimmed hat, the portable roof that had been his shield for years. He pressed his forehead against hers, a deep, silent touch that spoke volumes. The temperature of their emotion soared, held in check only by the steady, respectful rhythm of their breaths and the firm but unforced clasp of their hands. They stood close, intimate, and entirely whole. The boundary of respect held firm, but the emotional connection absolute. They spent the rest of the evening by the fire, talking about the future with the practicality of ranch owners. They agreed immediately to begin the process of formally adopting the 2 children they had rescued, giving them a permanent, stable home at Dry Creek. The ranch would not just be a cattle operation. It would be a warm kitchen and a classroom, a haven built on hard work and quiet compassion. The simple copper spike ring shone faintly in the firelight on Marion's finger, resting next to the calluses she had earned from the needle and the ladle. The small, waxed linen thread, which had once been a symbol of her desperate, solitary mending, was now housed in a clean, new box in her sewing kit. There would be more tears in the fabric of their lives, more holes to mend. But now, they knew they would always have the hands, the thread, and the courage to patch them together. The sun of the new grass season broke over the high plains with a startling, vibrant clarity. Gone was the red dust of summer and the blinding white of the sudden winter. The meadows of Dry Creek were a brilliant, impossibly lush green. Stretching away toward the mountains, the long-awaited sound of the creek, now fed by the melting snows, was a happy, rushing chorus, a promise of plenty and renewal. The cattle, thin but resilient, lowed contentedly in the newly fenced pastures. The roof of the rebuilt storehouse, sturdy and true, stood as a monument to community strength. The long arm of justice, powered by truth and a tattered ledger, finally reached its full extension. News traveled slowly but surely across the wide spaces Sheriff Silas Brand, caught by the military police attempting to cross into Idaho territory, had been apprehended. The paperwork, backed by the irrefutable evidence of Marion's logbook and Jonah's testimony, was complete, and he was being escorted back to the military court for federal charges related to the illegal transfer of vulnerable persons and abuse of authority. The full impact of their bravery was made public. Mrs. Whitcomb's stark, grainy photograph, showing the sheriff firing his pistol at an unarmed man carrying a child across a burning bridge, was reproduced in the regional papers. The image, printed side by side with excerpts from Marion's accurate, detailed manifest ledger, forced the territory to look directly at the crimes that had been committed in their midst. Society was finally learning the difficult, necessary lesson of accountability. Life at Dry Creek had found its equilibrium, settling into the quiet, hard work of building a family and a future. The two rescued children, now named Thomas and Eliza Simple, honest names, were thriving. Marion, no longer defined by a lie, devoted her mornings to teaching them to read, using chalk on a slate board set up inside the cookhouse. She taught them to recognize the alphabet, emphasizing that words held power and truth. In the afternoons, Jonah, his shoulder fully healed, taught them to ride, not with dominance, but with quiet respect for the animal and the land. Their evenings were filled with the simple, restorative sound of shared laughter around the supper table. The wedding was as simple and profound as their love. It was held on a brilliant afternoon beside the oldest, most steadfast birch tree on the property. Marion wore a dress fashioned from soft, undyed cotton, and Jonah, his worn leather vest and clean denim shirt, Lupe Ortega, his burnt hand fully healed, played a soulful, beautiful medley on his harmonica. Dr. Nakoe, his face serene and wise, officiated with quiet dignity as part of his blessing. He tied a thin strip of painted buckskin around their clasped hands. "May the trail be kind," he murmured. The ancient wish for two souls traveling together, the guests, the ranch crew, the Whitcombs, and a handful of respectful neighbors threw handfuls of popped corn over them instead of rice. A shower of white, light promises for their future. That night, the full moon hung high and cold over the ranch, illuminating the wide, familiar porch. They stood close, wrapped in Jonah's heavy canvas coat, the one that had protected them from the ice, the fire, and the bullet. Jonah turned, his gaze full of the quiet certainty that had always defined his character. He took Marion's face gently in his hands. It was a long, deep kiss, slow and profoundly honest, a benediction on their shared journey. It was a kiss that honored the long, careful road they had traveled, a commitment of presence and passion, now finally unbound by fear. His hand, large and warm, slipped beneath the coat, resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of warm intimacy and secure belonging. No more words were needed. The door of the main ranch house closed quietly behind them, sealing the privacy of their union, the sacred space now truly and wholly their own. The themes of their story stood out in sharp relief. Their love was not an act of blind passion, but a covenant of presence and safety, born not from mandate but from choice. The justice they achieved was not granted by a higher power, but required courage and community. And Jonah's masculinity was defined by his restraint, his deliberate choice to protect and shelter rather than dominate or inflict. The closing symbols shone with redemption. The simple spike ring, filed from the cold iron of the railroad's oppressive expansion, now gleamed on Marion's work-hardened finger, a symbol of a time redeemed. The new spool of linen thread, bright and strong in her sewing box, lay ready. Life would surely present new tears and new challenges, but now they faced them with the absolute knowledge that they possessed the strength and the commitment to mend them together. The narrative settled into a quiet, hopeful cadence. The sounds of the night were simple and peaceful. The low, croaking chorus of the spring frogs in the marsh, the gentle sweep of the wind across the new grass. The time of fear and chaos was replaced by a profound,
earned tranquility. Marion, resting her head against the solid warmth of Jonah's shoulder, smiled, a final flicker of the old game. "You know," she whispered, her voice low, "I am still not the woman you thought I was. Mr. Reddick." Jonah's hand came up, gently stroking her hair. "That is good, Marion," he replied, his voice a low rumble of contentment. "Then we get to continue learning each other for the rest of our lives." The path ahead was not straight or smooth. The road stretched out toward the formidable, eternally snow-capped peaks of the Rockies, a stark reminder that the frontier was always vast and untamed. But now, that path was shared. Love, justice, and survival had woven themselves into the fabric of the high plains. And two people, now one, belonged entirely to their own hard-won world. Thank you so much for traveling with Marion and Jonah through the Wild West. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts on their journey. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Give the video a like, and support further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.